Hey guys, and welcome to Lung Ultrasound Basics. My name's Steven. Let's get started. So first things first, I usually like to use the curvilinear probe for the majority of my lung exams. You can use the phased array. Linear is really only useful for lung sliding though. So when you start out, you're going to put the probe just below the patient's clavicle with the indicator pointed towards the patient's head. The orientation on the rib is going to be like this. So actually from the ultrasound's perspective, what you're going to see is ultrasound beams coming down here. Ribs are going to just basically be shadow for you. And that's because the ultrasound doesn't travel well through the ribs. They're so dense. So you're just going to see black shadowing behind them, just like this. Where you're going to be looking for pathology is actually the pleural line here. So you're going to be looking for either A lines or B lines generally, and we'll go over those a little bit here. So this is a normal lung. What you see is ultrasound not traveling through the ribs, the shadows here. And then you see a bright white line here, and that's the pleura. And these repeating lines here, that's actually A lines. So if we look at that a little more closely, rib shadow with the pleural line, what the A lines are is the ultrasound is just sending a beam at that pleural line. And since there's normal aerated lungs behind there, there's really nothing for the sound to bounce off of to transmit any images. So it just repeats that pleural line over and over and over and over again. So after you do the view just below the clavicle, we're going to slide down here into the patient's axilla. The indicator is still going to be pointed at the patient's head, and we're basically going to see the same thing. Rib shadows with just below it, just a bunch of A lines. The last view that we usually get is just of the diaphragm interface. So there we're going to be looking for any sort of effusions or consolidations. So you're going to be looking just in this pocket here to see if there's any sort of fluid collection. So normally without an effusion, what you're going to see is diaphragm and lung, and you won't see any sort of black fluid collection. Now, sometimes it's hard to see the entire diaphragm in these views, and that's because the sound waves actually, like we said, aren't transmitting well through the normal aerated lung. So this is a perfect example of that. You see a little bit of diaphragm back here. This is all liver down here. And then up here, all you really see is the lung come in and out of view, and you can't see a clear, full curved diaphragm. Now that's fine. Basically, if you see this view, you can say that there's no significant effusion. Another good hint is that you see bright white here. This is the spine, and it actually ends right at the diaphragm. And the reason is because the ultrasound waves aren't transmitting well through the aerated lung, so the spine looks like it stops right at the diaphragm. Now, if there was a fluid collection there, ultrasound waves probably could get through, and then you would see the spine continue above the diaphragm, and that's actually called a spine sign. Even though we're not talking about pathology in this lecture series, I just want to show you guys a picture of an effusion so that you have an idea of what it would look like. This is a clear shot of the entire diaphragm right here, and then all this black is fluid. So this is actually the tip of the lung floating in the fluid, and as you can see, it looks way different than the last image, and this is what you would see if there was a pleural effusion above the diaphragm. So some people do a lot more zones, but this is basically what we do in RED for lung scanning. 3 zones on each side, right below the clavicle, the axilla, and then just above the diaphragm. So you can look up different protocols if you want to have better sensitivity and specificity, looking for different pathology. We'll discuss that a little more in the pathology lecture. That being said, I just want to cover a couple of the findings for lungs here in the basic series because there's really not much to it, and definitely people are going to ask you about these things. The first is lung sliding. So what you're looking for lung sliding is whether or not the pleural line is moving, and that's going to give you an idea of whether or not there's a pneumothorax there. So this is what normal lung sliding looks like. You see right here, this line, it looks kind of like ants marching. So we're using the curvilinear probe here, and you can see from the footprint up here that it's curved. If you're having a hard time telling whether or not there's like little ants marching there on the curvilinear probe, if you switch to the linear probe, it's much more obvious. So if that line looks static and looks like it's not moving, that's concerning if there's no lung sliding and there could possibly be a pneumothorax. But like I said, we'll cover that more in the pathology lecture. The other couple things that I want to talk about is B-lines and A-lines. So we already discussed A-lines, but let's look at how B-lines look different. So B-lines can represent a number of pathologies, and we'll discuss that more in depth, but I just want you to be able to recognize them for right now. So again, we see rib shadow here and rib shadow here. In between, we see these big spotlight things. And what those are actually B-lines. So let's put that next to a picture of A-lines and see if you can tell the difference. So over here, we have normal A-lines, and over here, we have B-lines. So B-lines can be pneumonia, pulmonary edema, a lot of things. And we'll talk about that, like I said, in the pathology lecture. But I just want you to be able to recognize them and say whether or not they're present when you're doing basic lung ultrasound. That's basically it. So go out there and ultrasound some lungs and have some fun.